Ready to go deep on this one. We're tackling a phrase that's been around for ages. An eye for an eye. Everyone's heard it, probably even tossed it around casually. But what's the real story? Can't just be about revenge, right? It feels like there's got to be more to it. History, laws, maybe even some psychology thrown in.
Oh, absolutely. There's a whole lot packed into that seemingly simple phrase. It gets at the core of how societies grapple with justice and punishment. This concept, usually called lex talionis, goes way back, even before we had formal legal systems. Back then, if someone wronged you, it could easily spiral into this endless cycle of revenge. Your family retaliates, then theirs does, and things get out of hand fast. So, an eye for an eye was a way to hit the brakes on that chaos.
So instead of just letting vengeance run wild, this idea was actually a way to bring in some kind of order.
Exactly. It was revolutionary for its time because it aimed to establish proportionality. The idea was to set limits instead of just escalating the violence. It's like saying, look, there needs to be a consequence for wrongdoing, but let's make it fit the crime, not spiral out of control. It was a really early attempt to create a system of justice, even if it seems kind of harsh by today's standards.
So even though it sounds kind of rough to our modern ears, you're saying an eye for an eye was a step towards justice, not just a free-for-all of revenge.
That's the idea. It was about trying to create a system where the punishment matched the crime as closely as possible. And if we're talking about early examples of this in action, we got to talk about the Code of Hammurabi. We're talking almost 4,000 years ago, 1750 BC, back when writing itself was a relatively new invention. Can you imagine the level of detail they documented in their legal system, chiseling it all into stone?
It blows my mind to think about. This wasn't just some informal agreement. It was a carefully crafted legal code, literally set in stone for everyone to see. Talk about making a statement.
Yeah, the Code of Hammurabi is seriously impressive for its time. And when you look at the details, you can see how central this idea of an eye for an eye, this proportionality, really was. There's this one example that always gets me about a house collapsing. So let's say a house collapses because the builder messed up somehow and the homeowner's son dies in the collapse. Guess what happens? The builder's son is put to death as well.
Whoa. Talk about high stakes for ancient contractors.
Yeah.
That's a seriously stark example, but it really shows you how seriously they took this eye for an eye business back then. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was the law.
It really was. And while we might look at that example now and think it's harsh, the idea behind it wasn't just about revenge. It was about accountability, making sure the punishment really reflected the severity of the crime. Of course, even with a system as rigid as this, there were always variations in how it was applied. Even in ancient Babylon, where this whole eye for an eye thing was a big deal, it wasn't always a simple equation. Like, your social status played a huge role in how these laws were actually applied.
You mean if you were a somebody, the punishment was different than if you were a nobody?
Exactly. Let's say you committed a crime against someone who was higher up the social ladder than you. Well, the punishment was often way more severe than if you did the same thing to someone on your own level or even someone below you.
Wow, so it's like a sliding scale of justice, where who you wronged mattered just as much as what you actually did. That adds a whole other level to this eye for an eye thing, doesn't it? It's not as cut and dry as it seems at first glance.
It really isn't. And this whole idea of different interpretations of an eye for an eye, well, it becomes even more clear when you start comparing different cultures. Take Hebrew law, for example, the kind of stuff you'd find in the Torah. They talk about an eye for an eye, too, in books like Exodus and Leviticus. But later on, when you get to interpretations in the Talmud, things start to shift a bit. They actually leaned more towards monetary compensation in a lot of cases.
Wait, hold up a sec. So instead of taking an actual eye, they might have you pay the victim. That seems like a pretty huge departure from the original idea. What was behind that kind of change?
It's actually a really fascinating evolution. See, the Talmud, and this is a massive collection of writings and interpretations on Jewish law, basically argues that the original spirit of an eye for an eye wasn't about inflicting the exact same harm. It was about making sure the victim received fair compensation for what they lost, even if it wasn't always a literal eye for an eye.
That's really interesting. So they were moving away from a purely vengeful kind of justice and towards something that was more about making things right again.
Right, and that just goes to show you how much even these ancient, seemingly rigid laws could be shaped and reshaped by the values of the people who are interpreting them.
It really makes you wonder if the way we understand an eye for an eye today, that whole tit for tat thing, is even close to what it originally meant. And speaking of how we understand things, especially when it comes to decision-making and consequences, isn't that where our game theory source comes into play?
Absolutely, because an eye for an eye isn't just some dusty old legal concept. It's something we see playing out all the time in how people make strategic decisions, even if they don't realize it. And that's where game theory can give us some serious insights.
Okay, now you're speaking my language. I love a good strategic breakdown. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, maybe you can give us a quick refresher on what game theory actually is, for those of us who might not have a PhD in strategic thinking.
Uh-huh. Fair enough. In a nutshell, game theory is all about analyzing how people or even groups make decisions, especially in situations where the outcome depends on what other people do. It's like a big strategic chess match where everyone's trying to anticipate each other's moves to come out on top.
It's kind of like that feeling you get when you're trying to figure out what your opponent is going to order in a staring contest.
Yeah, kind of. Except in game theory, the stakes are usually a little higher than just bragging rights. We're talking about things like economic negotiations, political standoffs, even just figuring out the best way to split a pizza with your roommates. It's about understanding the logic behind those decisions when everyone's got something to gain or lose.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection to an eye for an eye here. We're always weighing our actions against what other people might do in response, right? Trying to strike that balance between getting what we want and avoiding negative consequences.
Exactly. And one of the most famous examples in game theory that really gets at this dynamic is something called the prisoner's dilemma. Ever heard of it?
It rings a bell. It's the one with the suspects, right? Where they have to decide whether to rat each other out.
You got it. It's a classic scenario. Imagine you've got two suspects who are arrested for a crime and thrown in separate cells so they can't talk to each other.
And the cops come in, all good cop, bad cop routine, trying to get them to crack.
Exactly. The authorities offer each prisoner a deal. They can either stay silent or they can betray their partner by confessing to the crime. And here's where things get really interesting, because the outcome for each prisoner depends entirely on what the other prisoner decides to do.
Ooh, the plot thickens. So they're stuck in this pressure cooker, having to make a life-altering decision without knowing what their partner in crime is going to do.
Yeah.
Sounds like a recipe for some serious trust issues.
You got it. So let's break down the possibilities, all right? If both prisoners decide to keep their mouths shut, stay loyal to each other, they both end up with a relatively light sentence, maybe a year or two behind bars. But if one of them spills the beans while the other stays silent, the snitch gets to walk free while the other one gets hit with a much harsher sentence, like 5 years. And if both of them decide to betray the other and confess,
Double the betrayal, double the fun.
not so fast. If they both confess, they both end up with a moderate sentence, say 3 years each. So it's not the best outcome, but it's not the worst either. It's that middle ground where they both pay the price for not trusting each other.
Okay, now my brain's doing loops.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm one of these prisoners, what's the best strategy? It seems like staying silent is the way to go, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we both cooperate and keep quiet, we get that shorter sentence and we're back to plotting our next heist in no time.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? And that's where the dilemma comes in. Because when you really think about it from each prisoner's perspective, confessing always seems like the safer bet, regardless of what the other prisoner does.
Hold on, walk me through that again. I thought we just agreed that cooperating was the best way to go.
It is, but only if both prisoners can be absolutely certain the other one will stay silent. But remember, they have no way of knowing what the other's going to do. So each prisoner starts thinking, okay, if the other guy stays quiet, my best move is to confess, because then I walk free. And if he confesses, well, I'm better off confessing too, because then I get 3 years instead of 5.
Ah, so it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy of distrust. They talk because they're afraid the other one will talk, and the very act of trying to protect themselves leads to a worse outcome for both of them.
Exactly. It highlights this inherent tension between self-interest and cooperation. They'd both be better off if they could just trust each other. But the fear of getting played, of ending up with that longer sentence, pushes them towards a choice that might not be the best for everyone involved.
Wow, it's like a crash course in why trust is so important, but also so fragile. And it's not just some theoretical thing, right? You were saying earlier that this plays out in the real world all the time.
Oh, absolutely. Think about those classic Cold War standoffs. You had two superpowers, each with enough firepower to destroy the world many times over.
Talk about high stakes.
Right. And in that kind of scenario, you might think the most logical thing would be for both sides to disarm, to reduce the tension and the risk of total annihilation. But because neither side fully trusted the other, they both kept building up their arsenals just in case. It was a classic prisoner's dilemma on a global scale.
So they were trapped in this cycle of an eye for an eye, but with nukes. each side escalating because they were afraid the other side would escalate, even though it ultimately made everyone less safe.
Exactly. Or think about something like international climate agreements. Every country knows that we need to work together to tackle climate change, but there's always this temptation to prioritize your own short-term economic interests, even if it means putting the planet at risk in the long run.
It's that temptation to go for the immediate win, even if it means potentially losing big time down the road. So how does this all tie back to an eye for an eye? Is the lesson here that always striving for that perfect balance, that tit-for-tat response, is ultimately self-defeating?
It's definitely more complicated than just saying an eye for an eye solves everything, right? The prisoner's dilemma shows us that while striving for balance and proportionality is a good starting point, it doesn't always account for the messiness of human behavior. Things like trust, communication, even forgiveness, those factors can completely change the game.
So it's not enough to just react to what someone else does. We have to factor in the bigger picture, think about the long-term consequences, and maybe even be willing to break the cycle of an eye for an eye if we want to find a truly better outcome.
Now you're getting it. It's about recognizing that the pursuit of justice, of fairness, it's not always a simple equation. It requires us to grapple with some pretty complex questions, and those questions have been challenging us since the days of Hammurabi.
It's amazing to think that this one phrase, an eye for an eye, can open up so many layers of history, psychology, and even global politics. Remember to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the Daniel David Allen YouTube channel where RoboCast is posted every weekday. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.